Hello everyone. Today we will explore the options for deploying any Docker based application. We will specifically talking about ECS, EKS and EC2. Which service you should choose to deploy your Docker based application. So for any Dockerized applications, what are deployment options you have? You have Amazon EC2, and then second you have containerization. And under containerizations, we have Amazon ECS, which is Elastic Container Service, and Amazon EKS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service. And both of them provides AWS Fargate, which is serverless. It means you don't need to worry about the servers, just work on the configuration side. And the second is Amazon EC2 instances. So let's talk about Amazon EC2. So what is EC2 instance? EC2 instance is simple standalone virtual machine. What do you need to run any Docker image on that EC2 instance? You need Docker installed on that machine, and you just need to pull the Docker image and deploy it. Docker image can be pulled from any of the registry like ECR, Docker Hub, GCR, from anywhere. You can just pull the Docker image and deploy it. Simple. You don't have to do anything else. Now let's talk about the responsibility. So when you deploy directly things on EC2 instances, what is your responsibility? First, you have to manage the EC2 instance. Auto scaling of EC2 instance, you can have the high availability and have 3 or 4 EC2 instances and your services are running there, but you have to ensure that you create the auto scaling group. AMI updates, which are more important, like you have to regularly update your AMI. If you don't do it, you could have some security defects and security issues on that particular EC2 instances. So the AMI updates, apply patches or any security updates on an existing instance. Ensure Docker service is running all the time on the server, because you have installed the Docker, so it's your responsibility that that service is always running on that system, and it is periodically updating also, right? You have to ensure that Docker version is getting updated on a regular basis. The last, and which is very important, cleaning up the Docker images or containers, because we are not using any anything or any managed service of AWS. So it is your responsibility to clean up any dangling images, any stopped containers. You have to do that. If you don't do it on a regular basis, you will see the disk space issues on a regular basis. Like once in a month, you will see that because of all stopped containers, all the images which are not being used, it consuming lot of spaces. So you have to ensure you plan, create a cron job to delete it on a regular basis. So this is at high level your responsibilities for the EC2 instances. Now the uses, when it is easy to use the simple EC2 instances. So for your standalone small applications, where you know that you just have one application, you can just deploy it on an EC2 instance. Very simple. When you really don't have any DevOps team in your organizations to manage complex architecture, which ECS and EKS provides. So for the very small applications, direct deploying on EC2 instance, it makes sense. When you want to have full control on underlying infrastructure, like this is your EC2 instance, you can do all the configurations you want. So if you need that control, the EC2 option is a best choice. And if your application has custom requirements that are not supported by containerization services, then you will go with this EC2 instances. No auto failover, like you are not really looking for any auto failover. You are saying that yes, if something happened to my containers, I will go there and start or stop or whatever is required, I will do that. So it is not because you have deployed that Docker containers directly. If anything happens like container crashes, it will not try to auto restart or auto stop the containers. Like the management of the containers is manual. If something happens, you have to fix it, and it is cheaper. because it's just one simple EC2 instance. Based on your application requirement, you can choose T2 micro, small, medium, according to the requirement of your application. So this is like a simple way to deploy any Docker based application on EC2 instances. It works. People previously used EC2 instances because of its simplicity. Now we will explore the second option, which is ECS. That is like on top of EC2, now the ECS comes, which is Elastic Container Service. So this is Managed Container Orchestration Service. It helps you to run and manage applications using containers. And in this, its container orchestration is automated. What does that mean? Like, this is the concern when you deploy something on EC2 instance. In ECS, it is automated. So basically, ECS automatically handles the life cycle of containers, including stopping and removing them. Or when something happens to your task, they stop. ECS ensures that containers are cleaned up also. So the cleaning up process is also automated. So that is what it's like, a container orchestration service, which is highly popular these days. And this actually serves all the purpose that is required for any Docker based application, until unless you have some specific configurations and that ECS does not support. Features. So ECS has a lot of features. So the main important features like managed draining capability. So recently AWS recently announced this managed instance draining. So this capability basically ensure that you can gracefully shut down the EC2 instances by safely stopping and rescheduling all your workloads to the new EC2 instances. So this particular feature helps when you are rolling out a new AMIs, right? So when you have to roll out the new AMIs, you really don't need to build any custom solution. Instead of that, it has inbuilt functionality that it will automatically launch the new instances and gracefully drain all the tasks which are running on the existing instance, and move it to the new instances using the new AMI. So this is like a major feature of the draining capability in ECS, which solves problems when application needs to run 24 by 7 and you need to ensure that mm, you are still compliant with all the AMIs and the patches on your EC2 instances on a regular basis. So ECS requirement. So what is required to run a Docker image on ECS? So in ECS, you need ECS cluster, which is free. There is no charge to create a ECS cluster. So you need that cluster. Under that, you create a ECS service. Under that, you will have a task and then a task definition, which is a low level part of the configuration, where you will be providing like what is your container image, right? From where to pull the image, and you need to specify CPU and memory configurations, like how much CPU and memory your application requires. So that is like at the lowest level, you need to provide all this configuration, and that's it. You don't need to worry about other stuff. Just configure these things and you are good to go. ECS deployment options. So now in ECS, as we have two options. First, EC2. So you are using an ECS cluster, but for the compute, you can use the EC2. Again, EC2 is a simple standalone VM, like we discussed with the EC2 options. It has managed draining capability, which I explained earlier, which is very important. And your responsibility is mostly just manage EC2 instance and the AMI updates and apply patches on a regular basis. You don't need to worry about the containerization, the cleaning part of the images and the containers. So when to use like the EC2 instances, like you can actually use it for all of your applications, high resource predictable workloads, and you need full control over configuration. So this options, when you are going with directly EC2 instance, you can actually choose ECS on EC2. which will, until unless you have some requirements where containerization is not supported. Other than that, you should use ECS with EC2 without any doubt, because the cost is simple, cost is same. You are still paying only for that EC2 instance. Either you are using the ECS or either you are using the EC2 instance. There is no difference on the cost perspective. It would be the same, and free you will get all the management of the service of your applications, like the containerization, auto failover, and all those stuff you will get in the ECS EC2 option. So my preference would be use ECS on EC2 over EC2. The second options we have Fargate, so which is serverless, so where you don't need any server to manage. What is your responsibility at high level? You just need to gather what is your application needs, right? Your application CPU and memory requirements. That's it. And it will follow the similar structure: ECS cluster, you create the service, task definition, and under that you just provide your application requirements. So Fargate, which is also very popular, it is good to use for small to medium application. Scaling is simple because now you can just scale up or scale down the containers based on the requirements or based on the demand. You don't need to think for the resource capacity because it is serverless. So you don't need to worry, oh, I just have 4 servers. How can I have 40 tasks running? You don't need to think about it. You can just have the auto scaling, like if the CPU goes 80%, I need 10 tasks, I need 15 tasks. You don't need to worry about the resource capacity. So that is like a huge benefit of using Fargate over EC2 instances. And even the patching part, even any AMI updates, you don't need to worry about anything. Limitations with this particular approach, the main major limitation is you can only define the CPU memory combinations which is defined as per the AWS documentation. Like sometimes if their combinations is like 2 CPU and 8 GB of memory, but you want like 4 CPU and 8 GB of memory, you might not get that configuration. You might get 4 CPU versus 16 CPU. So those are some limitations, but most of them covers, like all the default scenarios are covered in their combinations. But yes, if you are looking for some custom memory and CPU configurations, then it may not be the ideal. Again, for any small applications where you really don't need any control on the hardware on the EC2 instance, you don't need to worry about the configuration. The Fargate is the best option, is a better option over EC2, and it serves all the problems. It is little bit expensive for sure than EC2 instances, but it actually don't create more maintenance work in future. You don't need to worry about those things. No EC2 instance crashing kind of stuff, because everything is serverless. So it is expensive, but it provides you all the benefits, and just take over all the maintenance on them. So it is easier. It works for everything. um, the only thing that I just wanted to mention here, like sometimes your application startup time is very high. So like at the during a startup, your application needs consumes lot of memory and CPU. But once the startup is done, then it is just using 5% or 10% of CPU. So in that particular scenario, Fargate may does not make any sense until you fix your application startup things, because you have to give more memory and CPU to the Fargate task, because it needs at the startup. But it is you but then it would be expensive for you, because unnecessary you are just putting lot of memory and CPU just because your application is not designed as expected. So in that scenario, the EC2 instance makes more sense, because in EC2 instances you can just consume all of the memory and the CPU of that host at the host level. It is not going at the container level, and then it will gradually, because it just needs at the startup, so gradually it will decrease. So that's the only one scenario that I can think of where Fargate does not make more sense. So this is like about the ECS Elastic Container Service, both options, Fargate and EC2. Now let's talk about the Elastic Kubernetes service. So this is like a managed Kubernetes service and which is used for orchestrating large scale container deployments. So basically Kubernetes is mostly used for the complex applications and for the large scale container deployments. What is required to run a Docker image on an EKS cluster? So first you need EKS cluster. Like similarly, we have ECS cluster. Now you have a EKS cluster, which has a cost. Like currently it is 0.10 cent per hour basically. You have to upgrade EKS cluster on a regular basis. So whenever you create an EKS cluster, it comes with a specific version of the Kubernetes, and AWS has its own life cycle when it will be updated, when it will go to extended support, when it would be end of life. So once a year or once 1 year, 6 months, you have to upgrade the EKS cluster, which is mostly expensive and requires little bit more planning whenever you are doing the EKS cluster upgrade. You need Kubernetes experience. Like for the ECS, you really don't need any ECS experience as such. It is very easy. It's simple. It is like just a Docker image. You are running it and providing all the configurations. But for the Kubernetes, for EKS, you really need Kubernetes experience. And now to interact with the EKS clusters, you need some kubectl command installed on your system so that you can interact with the EKS cluster and deploy anything. There is no way you can deploy the image on an EKS cluster using GUI. Like from the console, you don't have any options. You have to use some kubectl or some other tools to interact with this EKS cluster and uh, deploy your applications. People use Helm charts also for deploying the applications on Kubernetes. Then you need Kubernetes deployment configuration files also, which itself little bit complex. If I talk about the ECS is just normal ECS service resources. It's like a AWS resources that you just need to create it. But here you really need a deployment configuration files. And if you use Helm, you need Helm deployment configuration files and knowledge of Helm. How does that work? So that is like Elastic Kubernetes service. Deployment options are same like EC2. It also provides both EC2 and the Fargate, and both have similar features that we talked in the ECS also, like managed draining and the Fargates auto scaling. All the features applies here also. There is no difference in both of them. When to use EKS? So EKS is used when you have actually a complex microservice architectures. You need multi-cloud like hybrid. Kubernetes is easy to shift from AWS to Azure or to any Kubernetes platform. So it, because it's a Kubernetes, so there is no specific like it is using any AWS kind of like ECS. You cannot just migrate it to Azure today. But in this, you can easily migrate your deployment from one place to another because of the Kubernetes is common across everywhere. And when you have a requirement of complex networking requirements, some networking like the Istio service mesh, something like that you wanted to use, and more Kubernetes based configuration, some access patterns, basically more complex architectures. If you have, then go for EKS. Otherwise there is no need to just go for EKS because it is new in the market or it is like looks good. No, ECS covers all the scenarios, mostly for the applications, which is the first. Whenever you are doing the POC or whenever you are evaluating the solution which one to choose, always see what are you going to use Kubernetes, what are you going to get from the Kubernetes, right? Are you actually need any information or any configuration that only Kubernetes provides? Do you have any specific requirements that we can in future can go to multi-cloud, something like that? If you don't have it, always opt for ECS, and ECS EC2 will solve all the problem. And if you don't have any problems with the Fargate and no expensive part, you are able to do that, then go for the ECS Fargate also. That is also a good option that solves all the problems. Like, I can just take an example, like just running Jenkins. Previously, we used to run it on EC2 instance. You can just run it on ECS Fargate. It works perfectly fine. ECS like Sonar Cube, you can just use it on ECS Fargate. You really don't need to worry about the EC2 instances. So things like that you can just use the Fargate, and for any small applications, very easy to use. Yeah, thank you.